I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East.
Meets West. I'm excited about this episode because I think this is something that I end up talking about with patients a lot, which is boundaries. Hey, Pete, ready to talk about
Hey,
talk about boundaries here?
I love boundaries, and actually,
I do
I
too. I do
I use
too.
one of your definitions.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Which one?
I forget.
You just knew it came from me. You were just you're in somewhere in the recesses of your mind. You're like,
You're gonna
it was the
probably
one
say it.
the
You're gonna you're,
teaching
you're gonna
the
say it today,
teaching.
but it's like compassion with boundaries, or is
Oh,
it
you're
empathy?
yes.
Empathy
Oh
is
no. No, I say so compassion. So empathy is without boundaries. So when we experience empathy, we feel other people's emotions as if they're happening to us.
yeah,
And compassion
that's what
is
it is.
is boundaried. So
That's right.
which is where
Well, no,
we're
so
yeah.
compassion is empathy with boundaries.
Yes, sure. So it's like
That's yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I love that Pete's starting with that example because no, because I boundaries are really important
Yeah.
for a lot of reasons. They're important for our own mental well-being. They're important for our healthy relationships, right? They're important for, I guess this goes to mental well-being, but being able to keep enough gas in our tanks, right? Like,
Yep.
is how I say it.
Yep.
But boundaries can be really hard to set. They're a part of
Yes.
assertiveness. People can sometimes feel that they're not worthy of setting boundaries, right? Or they
Yeah.
can be confused as to, like, honestly, like what their rights are. I've
Yeah.
heard, like, what am I allowed to say? Or if it's the other way, what am I allowed to ask for? Am I pushing someone's boundaries if
So
I
I
do
just had a
this?
birthday, and a friend of mine brought me a beautiful stone, and
Mm,
this blue agate stone, I think it's called AGAT. I don't know.
hmm. Sure.
And the description was that it helps people find their voice, assertiveness, and boundaries. And
Oh,
we
I
were
love
all
it.
laughing because they were like, "Well, we know you don't
Yeah,
need that
yeah.
definition." And not in like a pompous way. Really, I think I often do that with humility. So I think and that's what I was sort of reflecting as you were saying that, because I think people will be like, well, what do you mean you don't deserve that? Everyone deserves that. And it's like, it takes skill though,
It does.
in practice. And that's
It
the,
does.
yeah, yeah,
Well, because I think that, I mean, because like there's two sides of it. So I would say if we start with the side that Pete's getting at, which is when people don't believe that they deserve to have boundaries, and it might not be that conscious, I should say. It's not
right.
that I don't think that there's a lot of people necessarily that walk around and say I don't deserve boundaries, but they might unintentionally be sort of living that way because they're over focused on other people's needs before their own,
Right.
right? They think that their needs are like should always, come second or not at all, frankly,
Right.
right? So when you ask somebody that struggles in that way to think about like, well, what about your needs,
Right.
right? What
Right.
do you need first? That can be really uncomfortable. Does that
Right.
something you come across a lot with, I would say probably like in clinical work?
Yeah, yeah, it's very and I think that's why, like, say in dialectical behavioral therapy, we have a whole interpersonal effectiveness. We have a whole
Mm-hmm.
module teaching people how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yep.
and why do you think that is? Is that because maybe part of pathology or part of our kind of challenges with mood might be because people are taking advantage of us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually think it goes back to what you started with regards to empathy. I think that
Yeah.
people that are wired more empathically, and so dialectical behavior therapy, as we've talked about, was originally designed for borderline personality disorder, which is a just like an emotion dysregulation disorder. It's used for
Mhm.
all kinds of intense emotional disorders at this point in time. But the reason I bring that up is because it's talking about people that are biologically predispositioned to
Yeah.
experience emotions more intensely, and that
Right.
that goes into empathy. Like a
Hmm.
lot of when I used to do DBT, that was often a common sort of thread that these folks that struggled with that
Yeah.
diagnosis would really feel other people's emotions very intensely. And so
Right.
the benefit of that is that they're very caring. People that are wired that are very caring, very easily able to access like how that's going to impact somebody. But it
Yeah.
can get so loud that it then gets in the way of, okay, and what about you? Right? What do you
Yeah.
need?
And that will link to our values potentially, because boundaries also, I'm not going to set boundaries for the sake of boundaries. I'm setting boundaries for the sake of my values, right? it's got to,
Mm-hmm.
because I have to know where I'm going for that boundary. So I'm not just going to set a boundary with my boss because I'm going to set a boundary with my boss. I need to do it because they're taking advantage of me, because I want, I
Mm-hmm.
was passed up on a promotion, something like that. So I think it's important to and I think it's part of what we do clinically is help people untangle some,
Mm-hmm.
confusion that they might have around how they're feeling or why they're even struggling to set boundaries with somebody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And something you just said is also important to like tease apart a little bit, which is the other side of it, which is when people sort of, and I've heard this actually quite a few times, where someone says the word boundaries, they'll say, well, these are my boundaries,
Yeah.
and that's just it, that person's violating my boundaries, and they'll sort of use on the surface the appropriate language, but in reality they're actually just practicing rigidity,
Yes.
right? That they'll say like, I told this person, I don't know, let's say, I'm gonna make up this example. Let's say I'm working with a patient who tells me that a friend asked them if they could pick up their mail while they're on vacation.
Yeah.
And my patient says to me, I said, no way am I ever doing that. Those are my boundaries. I don't drive to that part of town on the weekends because the traffic is terrible. Those are just my boundaries.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, I don't know if that's your boundaries. That to me sounds like a rigidity and not practicing maybe compassion or flexibility or acting in line with the value of maybe
Yeah.
supporting a friend, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, like I gave the example of the stone because, we could all benefit from it. So I'm not, even though I'm pretty skilled at it,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and I can still benefit by having a stone in my room that might help bring me some clarity as I'm setting boundaries, or
mm-hmm,
as I'm trying to, and in many different, because all the different hats that I wear, I could
mm-hmm.
see it coming up. I think sometimes in the world that we live in, there's just different expectations, and so I think sometimes people, you know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of like, I don't know, like companies, like it's no longer like customers always right. Like I've had so many experiences lately where they're
well,
just like, what?
I would say, well, boundaries can change, right? Like they're
Yes,
they're
yeah,
not set in stone. That I think that's, like with everything Pete and I talk about on this podcast, that we want to practice flexibility. And what that means is becoming curious about what works in this moment. And
yeah,
so, I don't know, like maybe to kind of use a business example, like I have a boundary where I don't email with patients,
yes,
however, I have in the electronic health record that I use, I can do a secure messaging feature, which functions like email.
sure,
So back in the day, I didn't do that, and now I do. So it's like,
right.
I still have
You
boundaries,
still
right?
have
And
boundaries
I've changed about like what works for me, right?
because you're flexible.
Because I'm practice flexibility. That's right. So it's like, I think that's where people can get confused of like,
Yeah,
like what am I allowed to say? Like, what am I like, what's the line? And I'll say sometimes like, sometimes you don't know, you've got to try it out. Like there's
you got to practice.
yeah, you got to practice. That I've mentioned to people before that a yoga teacher once said in a class, I don't remember how this came up around boundaries, but she said, we teach other people how to treat us.
Yeah,
And
isn't that
that just,
beautiful?
oh, it just like so deeply resonated with me.
So
And
that so boundaries are teaching other people how to treat
to
us.
treat us, right?
Yeah,
Because we set the boundaries,
I
right?
love
Like,
that.
and it's like, when I talk about that in therapy with people, again, use myself as an example, and I'll say, look, even people that are well-meaning can sometimes end up crossing a line
Of
unintentionally. I'll
course.
say, like, I don't share my cell phone number, my
Yeah,
personal cell phone with patients. And I'll say, what do you think would happen if I did?
right.
And I'll say, look, there are some clinicians that do, I'm not
Yeah,
judging them. I'm saying, but for me, that doesn't work. And they'll say,
right.
well, people would call you on it or they text you. And I said,
Yeah,
yeah. And I'm like, and that's not their fault because I'm saying, here, have access to me. So
that's
I
right.
say, you don't, you have to call my work number. And I'm like,
Yeah,
what does that teach you? It teaches they say to me, well, it teaches you that you're only available during certain times. I said, that's right.
yeah,
You know?
yeah. Which is a really healthy boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And so listeners, like that's part of what you want to do while you're, thinking and considering what your boundaries are, because I have the image of like a forest, because
Mm.
like trees are often the perimeter of the boundary.
Mm.
And I think that that's a lot of what I'm asking people to do is to
Mm-hmm.
think about where their boundaries are. So think
Mm-hmm.
about where your forest is, how far out is it? How dense is it?
Are
Is
you
it
cutting it
open?
back? Or are
Are you
you
cutting it
growing it
back? Are you
further?
growing it
Right. I love
further?
that. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Pete, I have a question for you because, one thing
Uh-oh.
that oh, it's, I know, no, I think you'll like it.
Okay.
Because I think this is something that I also comes up a lot, is that, sometimes when I'm doing boundaries work with patients and we're talking about how to set boundaries and even framing it, as aligned with values and a part of self-respect, a lot of times people will tell me that they're afraid of other people's reactions to their boundaries because
Yeah.
sometimes people can be mad,
Yeah.
right? Mad at them when they say no. What do
Yeah.
you like? What do you tell people when that comes up?
I channel my inner Albert Ellis.
Let folks know who
So
Albert Ellis is.
well, tell me, was he dysfunction or irrational? I
He's
always
REBT. He's
No,
irrational thinking.
irrational. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, oh, that's right. Duh. Yeah. So Albert Ellis, rational emotive behavioral therapy, and so he would just be like, "That's irrational." It's like
Hmm.
you can't predict. And second
Well,
wave,
but we'd say, but what if it is somebody that gets mad when you say no to them?
then they'll be mad when you say no to them.
That's what, yeah. And then
and
what if
that's
people say like, oh no, but they're going to be mad?
and you'll breathe and take another breath, and you'll step into the next moment. It's a lot of, because it makes sense for you in that moment. And in Buddhism, as you study and kind of advance, there's the five precepts, and I
Hmm.
think that might be important just to kind of, because I haven't talked
Yeah,
much about that
I
here.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know what they are at all. Tell
Well, they're
me.
the boundaries within living, essentially, right? So we've talked about the Four Noble
Mm,
Truth, about how suffering is the
mhm,
Eightfold Path, is ways, behaviors that you could do to get there, and then the precepts are like boundaries for what is meant to kind of bring and like a virtuous life. So you refrain from
mm,
killing anybody. You
mhm,
refrain from taking what's not given to you. You refrain from the misuse of the senses, including and that's mostly like sexual misconduct.
mhm,
Refrain from wrong speech. So, like, again, no the rumors. And
mhm,
then this last one is from refraining from intoxicants that cloud the mind, because
mm.
you're really trying to get clarity. So I think, the five precepts present a little bit of these boundaries within your own existence as you're thinking about sort of the Buddhist meditative way. What do you think about that?
Oh, I love that. And the word that was showing up in my mind, I know I said it a moment ago with regards to the self, it was respect, that it sounds
Yeah.
like about respect for oneself, like respect for the body, respect for others,
Yeah.
right? That boundaries are really about communicating respect, I think,
Yeah. Yeah. It absolutely is.
right?
So, yeah, because you could probably substitute refrain with respect
Yeah, right? It's
in
about,
those precepts. Yeah.
yeah, I love that. One other thing I think a lot about with regards to boundaries is how, because I think this is also confusing for people, especially those that maybe struggle with interpersonal boundaries, is that boundaries actually create space.
Yes.
And of course, I'm going to use a yoga metaphor or
Please.
analogy. So hopefully, for those listeners who have practiced yoga before, there's a pose called side angle, where basically you're kind of bending into your front knee, and your hand can reach the inside, like
Yeah.
of the inside of your leg and touch the floor. And so there's a way to bind in that position where basically you reach your arm underneath the bent leg, and then you take your top arm, reach it behind your back, and you can hook your hands over your leg if you have the flexibility to do that.
Right.
And what I find really interesting about that pose is that what they'll talk about is that boundary. So actually reaching around and hooking your arms together over your leg cracks open the heart. It creates
Mm.
space. And I always use that with patients to say that's how boundaries function. That
Yeah.
actually, like the boundaries in therapy, that by actually maintaining certain boundaries of treatment, it creates space for connection to occur.
Yeah.
Because without the boundary, you actually, like people that are like too much in each other's business or something, right? It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
they're sharing every single thought that's in their mind at all times. It's like it's actually like mucky, kind of. It
Yeah.
clouds things.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that resonate with you at
Well,
all?
it's important, I think, for listeners to understand that. So, as psychologists, right, we don't share a ton about ourselves in session, and it's not because we don't want to. Well, I don't know. It's part of the process. I think the way you just described it is
Yeah.
exactly it. Is that because it gets muddy then if there's like a mutual share, rather than us working with what you as a client, or what our clients are going through,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise, then, like, I like that, it gets murky.
It gets murky, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like obviously,
It creates space with having those boundaries.
yeah, and it's like, and that crosses over into other relationships. It's like if you have a friend where the other person is always, doing all the talking or sharing all their
Yeah.
problems, and it's like there's no room for you. It's like there needs to be limits in order for space to occur, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, yeah, and also one of the thing because
mhm.
oftentimes people will describe that therapy as their closest relationships, because of how
The
intimate,
intimacy.
right? Because how
Yeah.
intimate the process is. And I think that's models that
Mhm.
even with boundaries, you
The
could have the
connection.
closest connection possible.
That's right. That's yeah. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, that because connection needs air. I don't know.
Yeah.
So sorry, it needs air, right?
Yeah.
It needs space, which of course, just speaks to what we always talk about with mindfulness. So, hopefully, this is got the wheels turning for people about the importance of boundaries, why we set them, and maybe you can walk away from this episode really thinking about how boundaries are a way to create space and respect for ourselves and others. This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.